Look around and stuff. This is America, 1980, 1990. And this is in response to my granddaughter writing some sort of final term paper on the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, if you can imagine. Disclaimer, I should have put a disclaimer on the previous ones I've done. I'm not an historian. I'm pulling stuff out my memory, and I can get things jumbled up in time, but overall the timeline, if I'm willing to say from 50 through 90, the stuff I'm saying fits in that timeline somewhere. Okay, so the last one I was doing was I had sort of gotten into the 80s, but I hadn't, so I'm going to take it from like mid 75 maybe to 90, and what I tend to do is I get stuck toward the middle of a period, like the 50s, I get stuck in the middle, 60s, so on. Okay, so I'm dealing with 1980 to 1990, or somewhere in the 1990s. And some of the trends, and the reason I've already highlighted, there's no artificial boundary. The world doesn't change from 1989 to 1990. It doesn't work like that. It's a continuum. So trends and patterns are continuing along a timeline, and they bleed from one hunk to another hunk. And thinking about it over the last day or so, there are various trends that had started after World War II that had continued through this whole period, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And one of them I want to highlight out is that once upon a time in America, there was a lot of factories. America, everything was made in America at one time. There were imports of certain things for sure. I'm not saying that. Some luxury items came from France. England made various luxury items. People wanted Rolex watches. They were made in Switzerland. So there were imports. And there were certainly exports. We exported grains out of the United States. Way, way, way a long time ago, there was import of alcohol, rum, from the Caribbean. That had been going on forever and a day, so I'm not saying there was not trade going on, but not to the degree that it began after World War II and started in the 50s, increased in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Trade, worldwide trade began, and as I said earlier, there was a shrinking of the world. In World War II, we had been isolated, and they were over there, and they were over there, and didn't mean anything to us, but then the World War came along, and the world had shrunk. And after World War II, and the Soviet Union had strategic nuclear weapons, and everybody, well, we and they had missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the world shrunk again, because now war could be, wasn't like Pearl Harbor where you, well, that was a surprise attack, but now you've got 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes flight time from some nuclear launch thing in the Soviet Union until it hits some target in the United States. The world had significantly shrunk. I had mentioned that Nixon in the 70s had gone to China to open up China. They had been isolated, self-contained, and been tightly controlled by the Chinese government there. And he made an effort to, and I think it was both, he went both ways. He was looking for them to become a buyer of American products, food. And we had for some time, even during World War II, we provided aid, foreign aid to Russia in terms of food and equipment to help them fight the Nazis. And we continued to do that after the war. It was always funny or weird. I think that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when the Cold War got established to a good degree, that we were still providing grains to the Soviet Union because they had not turned a corner away from communism more toward a free enterprise system. And they were always short. The central government said we'd grow 100 tons of grain this year, and they might grow only 80, and they'd be short, and we would have to help. Why in the world are we supporting the Russians when they've got strategic nuclear weapons? And there was some weird thoughts that, hey, we don't want them to have revolution there and throw out the current leaders because they might be more militaristic and more hostile toward us than the current people are. So we make friends with the devil. And that was our long-term, and probably still is to some degree, our international or foreign affairs, the State Department, that a known quantity is better than an unknown quantity. So we'll support, even a bad ruler as opposed to supporting some revolutionary. And it varies on who we're talking about, when it was, and who was president, and what was the general consensus. We supported Castro when he wanted to overthrow the government in Cuba, and immediately upon getting into office, he said, screw you, go away, we're going to become a communist country. We were sort of betrayed in that essence. But we had supported Fidel Castro in his overthrow of the regime in Cuba at the time. But then we also supported Shah of Iran, and then a whole lot of missteps, and it's hard. Foreign policy is hard. Anyway, I'm trying to zoom back out. There were trends that were going on. The world had started shrinking. It was no longer geographically bound because of missiles and airline travel. Migrations picked up all through that period. People moved from country to country. Americans left and moved overseas, blah, 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 blah. We imported wine from Greece, Italy. We imported fruits and bananas and vegetables from South America, or beef from South America. We had been doing it all along, but it began to pick up more so. Okay, so one of the major trends that I don't want to forget about was, once upon a time, everything was made in America, but that had been changing. And it was not uncommon for someone out of high school or whatever to go to work in a factory as what's called a blue-collar worker. He worked in a machine assembling something, or an auto factory where he was in charge of putting a tire on one wheel over and over all day long. That had begun to change. That was normal. Someone would go to work at a factory and they worked for 30 years. And they got their periodically pay raises, but they had a steady job and a steady paycheck, and they could eventually buy a house, or at least get a mortgage for a house, and raise their children. Well, that had begun to change, and one of the things that came along in the 60s, 70s, and bled into the 80s was, if we'd had in late 70s, late 60s and early 70s, I told you the culture had fractured, and it was a cultural period, cultural change, segregation and racism, civil rights. We had some cultural dynamics going on. And that was followed up, and had been part of the reasons for that. One of them I had ignored and left out was technology advances were occurring. The transistor had been invented in the 40s and began to come into consumer goods. The breadth and width of consumer products began to increase, and provided the average consumer with some technology that was absolutely unheard of in 1940s and 1930s. And in the early 80s, actually a little bit before that, IBM had started and built the first personal computer. IBM owned the world in a sense, from large, big, giant computers. And they'd been around for quite some time. Even in the 1950s and 60s, IBM had been computerizing the world, and the government was one of the first users, as well as the military. They had to deal with big data. You got 200 million people in the United States, or whatever it is. You got to collect income taxes from. You have to process forms, records. So that all required computers, and that had IBM was a massive in that particular area, but computers had also gotten where there were home hobbyists, as there had always been. There were always home people who had interest in this or that, or a passion for this and that. Like I'd explained before, my father and my uncles and my grandfather were hunters and fishing. That was a continuation from an earlier period when you didn't have to go to the grocery store. You go out and kill your own animals and get your own meat and fish, grow your own corn, that sort of living off the grid concept. Technologically, it had also changed. A consumer could buy vacuum tubes and transistors and build their own equipment, and amateur radio operators, I was one of them, broadcasting all over the world. But the technology began to change a lot. In the early 60s and early 70s is when seatbelts came into cars. There were no seatbelts in cars before that. The government took more actions and started having more influence over the automobile manufacturer and insisting upon safety provisions like seatbelts. Also, the gas mileage of a car. Early cars in the 1960s and even 70s got maybe 10, 12, 15 miles a gallon. That was max. But gas was cheap, 30 cents a gallon, 40 cents a gallon, 50 cents a gallon. So nobody really cared, but the government did, and they started formalizing rules about the fleet from a manufacturer should average 20 miles per gallon of estimated miles per gallon of cars. That came in the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s. But those sort of regulations, and the federal government had continued to grow. It was always getting bigger, always taking up new sort of regulatory areas. The environmental issues, water quality, air quality, I said, was all through during that period, and began to instill rules that affected all states. And the interstate road system had helped the transportation distribution systems of products that was even made in the United States could now come from California to the U.S., to the East Coast, which before had been a much harder, difficult job to do. Yes, railroads were around, but you also had the rise of tractor trailers and the Teamsters Union. There were strikes, railroad strikes, there were Teamsters Union strikes. All through that period, there was continued to be, there was an economic boom as well. Technology was coming on. IBM came out with personal computers. They expected to sell 400,000 units the first year. I think they got orders for 1 million or something. Personal computers, people, individuals could have their own computer. Now, I was one of the first. I had it in 1984 or something like that. And at the time, there was no internet. And I think maybe pagers came in somewhere during that period. You could have a pager, but not a cell phone. And pagers, some of my kids had those, and somebody else could call up the phone and say, "Page Julie," and Julie would get a note saying, "Oh, Ron wants to speak to you. Call him." That was the pager concept. And those became common in contractors, people who were on the road for a living, or like a real estate agent. Really important for them to have something like that because they were on the road out and about, and communications began. They could see, and everybody could see, that communications would be a beneficial thing to do, and money was put into it and researched it, and cell phones were being developed, if you will. And I think cell phones may have been around in the early 80s already, but very expensive, and only for some people. They were more like car phones, almost built into your car. But they were available, but they were coming. And money was being put into infrastructure to support better everything. But one of the factors was that people used to go to the factory and work for 30 years. Okay, well, that had begun to change. World trade had picked up. China began, and actually Japan was the first major trading partner for the United States. And they invaded, if you will, with their automobiles. And it's interesting, there was the chairman of Chrysler Corporation. They've changed names so many times. But he was saying in an interesting way that had not the Japanese entered the American car market, that the Americans would have had to invent the Japanese, because prior to the Japanese coming into the American car market, the quality of product coming out of Detroit was not particularly sterling. The Japanese came in with a high quality product at a low price. That forced all of the American car makers to raise their game, to build a better product, to be competitive. So we now have world forces at play that are making American companies respond to foreign competition. And it was, I think, automobile industry was one of the first, but the Japanese also started producing all sorts of electronics, the first VCRs and even higher scale televisions, which had all been American made early on, now came from Japan. Sony Corporation, Sony Walkman, Sony FM AM portable radios, Sony this, Sony that. They became, RCA had once upon a time, General Electric once upon a time, but they now had competition, and it was good as or better and than the American products, and so those corporations had to adapt. And what I'm saying along the line is that some of the products that came in, American corporations simply could not compete, and they went out of business. Or they got smart and said, well, we'll just move our manufacturing facilities to Japan, or we'll move it to China, or we'll move it to Thailand or something, and we'll use their cheap labor. And so there was a crumbling of home manufacturing in the United States. And when I mean home, I mean everything built here. Stuff started disappearing. Factories started disappearing. We're not making coat hangers in America anymore, because we cannot compete where you're paying $2 an hour to some Chinese laborer who's happy with $2 an hour, when we're having to pay 7 or 8 or 10 or whatever it was, plus what other benefits he got. So the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, there is this whole switch over to a world economy. We were told, brilliant, the big people out of Harvard, Yale, the economists of the world trade's the way to go. It will improve the standard of living for everyone. That was the concept. It's a good thing. All theories say it's good. Well, we bought into it. Our government bought into it. They set up free trade agreements with various countries so they could send their products here without tariffs. One of the Japanese things, they ruined the American steel market. Once upon a time, Pittsburgh and other places were massive steel industry. Steel, we were a major exporter of steel around the world at one time, but we had gotten beat again. The Japanese were doing it more efficiently, more quicker, a better product. And the other thing you have to keep in mind, it's interesting, the longer a country is around, they built those steel mills in the 1940s or whatever, okay, and they were still using them. Here's a country like Japan who's been decimated after World War II. They skip all the in-between steps. They now use the technologies available to them in the 1970s or 60s. Much more efficient from every aspect, much more quicker, better, faster. They skipped. They didn't have to invest in all that stuff in between. That's true today in countries that were once considered primitive, like in Africa. They don't string copper lines for telephone lines around. Why do that? They can put in cell phone towers. They skipped. They're going to skip that whole technological requirement of stringing the telephone lines. You see what I'm saying? That happens all over the world, and it happened in Japan and China, and we're stuck with the old technology, which we've invested in, and we use it for as long as we can, and that was what happened in the steel industries. We were using the old stuff. It cost too much to implement the new stuff. The unions had come into the steel industry. Steel workers were making a lot of money, same way with the railroads. Unions that come in, they're making a lot of money, but we can't compete with cheap labor that are exporting products where labor is cheap into the United States. So there was a crumbling of homemade, made in America. There was a crumbling of made in America through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010. You keep it going. And now we're in a situation where we're beginning to rethink this whole American trade concept, or worldwide trade concept, because now we have only one major source for something. And maybe they don't agree with our politics and they said you can't have it anymore, then what are we going to do? So single sourcing is now becoming a question. Like all of Apple products been made in China for the last 15, 20 years or whatever. And if the Chinese politics change, or America and China don't get along anymore, then maybe Apple don't got no more products coming out of China. So the whole concept of world trade is being futz. But during that period you had that. We had personal computers come into play. So one of the things, another impact of that was that once upon a time, you had Harvard, Yale, MBAs, whatever. They go into business. You know, the big corporations all have MBAs or Masters or Bachelors of Administration or whatever. You know, they know about business. They know this stuff. Well, sometimes in the late 60s, early 70s, spreadsheets came into existence. What a horror. Now you've got MBAs and people who are supposed to be trained in that having access to a computer with a spreadsheet on it. And they're told, we need to increase our efficiency here or something there. Use it, use the tools and think about it and decide what to do. So in a spreadsheet, the limited world of a spreadsheet, they quickly ascertained that that factory over there has got to go. You're going to lay off, that whole town's going to dry up. Doesn't matter to me. What's important is the corporation. We have to compete with foreign. We have to continue to make a profit. And in a bloodless, dry spreadsheet, decisions were made without a care that that town was going to dry up and go away, because all of the jobs, that whole town was dependent upon that big factory that was there. And that's what occurred, and the term Rust Belt came into being during the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Through that whole period, it didn't happen overnight, but it gradually. And cities got decimated. Corporations in their wisdom, with the MBAs sitting way up there in their crystal towers, with spreadsheets with only so many parameters in the spreadsheet, which did not include maybe the local impact upon a locality, i.e. you're killing the town. They made decisions without, and it's sort of doofus, and it continues to be so today. The corporations have to factor in that, because if you keep if you keep cutting factories out of the circuit, keep laying off people, that reduces the number of people that have a payroll check to buy anything, including the product you think you're trying to sell or service. It's a self-defeating sort of thing. You have to take in for efficiency's sake, you have to have consumers. I don't care what business you're in. Somebody's got to consume your product, or you can't stay in business. And some corporations, decisions were made that laid off masses of number of people, with the idea that somehow somebody else was going to pick up the slack, and other people would buy the product somehow. But you've already laid all these people off. They can't even buy food now. You see the point I'm trying to make? It is a difficult thing to do. I'm not saying it's not. The same way the federal government has a very difficult job determining on how to place, regulations and standards in that do not hurt more than they help. And that is a difficult decision in business as well. And for the government, their foreign policy, decisions which do not hurt more than they help. Okay, so there was a crumbling, and the middle class, blue collar, lower middle class, really got hit hard, and I mean really hard, through the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010, because of world trade. Companies simply pulled out their manufacturing out of the United States and went other places. We signed a free trade agreement with Mexico. Things that were built in Mexico did not have a tariff on them. So air conditioner people is an example who had been scattered here and there all over the country. They closed those plants. They moved manufacturing to Mexico, where they paid people there $2 an hour, $3 an hour. They also don't have environmental protection agency regulations like was in Wacola, Wisconsin, or in Memphis, Tennessee. They had regulations there they had to meet, which cost them money, which added to the cost of the product. But if they moved the factory to Mexico, the Mexicans didn't care about air pollution or water quality pollution. Another benefit of moving your factory out of the United States. The poor middle class really got cut. And I heard an economist, this Nobel-winning economist, saying, yeah, there's always a few people hurt when you go to world trade. And that's just the cost. And I go on thinking to myself, yeah, you can say that, but how about all those people out there that relied on that one plant to keep that whole area going? You've gutted them. What are they going to do? The only thing they know how to do is the job they had. And the government did nothing to help. They promoted free trade, they cut tariffs, they established free economic zones or whatever it was with other countries because it would be cheap product. They were also supposed to be an importer of our goods, but the middle class, and they were importer and they still are importers of our technology. Things are designed by Apple and the United States. Engineers, scientists, that's us. In fact, I think to some extent it wasn't a single decision made by God or a single decision by the government. It was lots of little decisions. We would be the designer, like Boeing aircraft, Apple computers, IBM computers, creators of cell phones. We would be the designer. We would be the high-end, pay an engineer $400 grand a year to develop circuits that will let cell phone talk to the internet, but we won't make them here because we can't. Now, that's not really true. We could make everything here. It would just be totally robotic and very high-tech and not employ very many people. Sooner or later, I think we're going to realize that, and there will be manufacturing is going to come back in the United States, especially if fuel costs get high. Transportation of anything becomes more expensive. And so the foreign trade concept starts losing some of its luster because you've got so much transportation expenses associated. They might have an advantage in cheap labor, but if you pile on all the fuel expenses of transporting it from way over there to here, you lose some of that competitive advantage in the total end price. So I think some manufacturing is going to come back here. Will it come back at the same pace? No. In 1960, I think General Motors may have employed 800,000 people to produce 5 million cars a year or whatever it was. Okay. In the year 2000, they produced 10 million cars a year using 300,000 people. That is technology, robotics, efficiency. That was a trend, and it has continued. It started, and technology. America is a technology leader. We have been, it's been coming for some time. We have a good high education system. A lot of, over the years, I've heard moaning. Our higher education system is crap compared to, tests that are done around the world. The Japanese are much better at mathematics, and these people are much better at this and that, so on. Well, for the longest time, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, I don't think I ever saw a piece of software that was not invented and made right here in the United States. It took the world a long time to develop software engineers of any quality. Now, I agree. There are now video games and things like that. Japan still produces video game consoles. And Microsoft produces one, but they're sort of dominant. Those are the players. Japan still does that. Japan still exports all kind of products to us, not at the level they once did because the Chinese can do it cheaper. Again, Japanese is not the steel manufacturing that they once were, although they still have it in very high quality steel, and they have the markets for that. But the Chinese have literally grabbed the steel market, and they have other. They're in a unique situation. Their government can subsidize, and that's some of the complaints that's going on right now. The government can subsidize a particular industry, and the resulting retail product is so low that no other corporation anywhere in the world can produce it at that price. So the Chinese government literally can own a market. They can drive all their competitors out of business. Now in the United States, one time it was like that. Competitors here in the United States did that too. They could take a loss, if you will, for a long time and drive other competitors out of business, or they played other funny games. But we have laws against that now, that all kind of regulations and things prevent that sort of market manipulation. Well, the Chinese government does it, and that's one of our complaints right now with electric vehicles is the government is subsidizing, so the Chinese are going to dump high quality, low cost electric vehicles in the United States, and our automobile manufacturers here will not be able to compete because the labor costs, for one, is astronomical compared to what the Chinese are paying, and we have various regulations that costs they have to be added to the retail price of the end product. We have other factors, healthcare, all kind of stuff. All right. So anyway, all during this period, you have technological moving through. Of course, there were continued advances in the Civil Rights Act. Groups, the population had continued to grow, and because of the fracturing which occurred, there were now subcultures appearing of all kinds and in all places, and you see more disparity even from state to state. I went to, in the 1970s or mid-70s, I went up to the Boston area, never been there. I went to a computer company that had got established up there, and that was going on as well. Intel came out with their first microprocessor or computer on a chip in mid to late 70s, something like that. And I could see that that was going to have a major impact. It took the next 50 years, but it did. And they were going to be in everything, and they're slowly getting in everything, computerization of everything. But it took a while, and the universities were and do produce high-quality education. There are a lot of smart people in the United States. There are a lot of smart people in Russia. There's a lot of smart people in China, and you cannot ignore that. And they've gotten better at it. The Russians have gotten better. Everybody's gotten better at it. And there's always been foreign student exchange going back and forth. Chinese came here for a long time and went to the university to learn a lot of stuff. We've sent people overseas into England and France and Paris, and we've learned stuff. That's been going on through the whole period. And there was, as I said, if Made in America just got gutted by world trade, and it still is, so the Rust Belt has not come back. The government was saying, oh, the Rust Belt, well, they just need to retool, and they can start manufacturing cell phones in the middle of Idaho. There's a company there that was doing mining, which we outlaw now because it's too polluting. They just have to be retrained. We'll help them. We'll retrain them, and so they know how to assemble widgets. They're not going to design the widgets, but they can at least manufacture them and make a living wage. Okay. There are lots of economic factors and influences that stretch through this whole period, and they work their way down into the daily life of every individual. For me personally, I was an engineer, and I lived around Washington, D.C., which is dominated by the federal government, and it was dominated by the defense contractors. The government continues to increase the spending on defense, and you need smart people now to design things based on computers, because you're going to put a computer in everything, from a missile to an aircraft carrier. You know, the PhD colonel, and there are PhD colonels and majors in the Air Force and the Army. There are MBAs. They're smart people, and they're in the military, and they can see it. And they, you know, the F-15, F-35, those things were thought about 30 years ago and envisioned and planned for and thought about and eventually came into being at the cost of $1 trillion maybe over its lifespan. But that required education, a lot of education. You can't be a high school graduate. You're not going to find much in that arena of our economy without having a high quality education. Well, we focused on that. That's where the money was going. That's where the money is if you want to make big money. But there's also money to be made in the services industry, being an electrician or a plumber. The focus on getting a skill set, I do not think was ever been emphasized enough in the public education system. I think they were, you get a high school graduate, once upon a time, if you're a high school graduate, you could get a job just about anywhere, working in a factory, putting a tire on a car. You didn't have to have a lot of skill set. But that was changing. And to get any kind of real money, you had to either have an innate ability to learn and teach yourself, or you had to become an apprentice and learn a skill set. That is still true today, and it became more and more so. You can't walk out of high school expecting to have a very good high lifestyle, without a skill set. Okay? So anyway, the requirements for the higher paying jobs have been increasing over this whole period. I was an experienced, educated guy, and what became common was not only that the middle class had gone away, but that high educated people who knew about this or that, especially computers, because they were relatively new, IBM, governments, and they had limited people doing COBOL, and it was all business programming, but now you need it in the scientific community. So instead of, whereas half of the labor force is being cut out because they don't need them anymore, we can't afford them because it's going to build it in Japan or China or Indonesia or some such place. Now we have shortage of engineers, people who can understand how to build this widget or that widget, or design circuitry to do complex matrix communications between, anyway. So now you got the other situation where you shifted companies. It was not uncommon. The idea of going to work for the same company and working there for 30 years, that was not even in the cards anymore. You go to work for a certain company, you gain a skill set, you rise up in salary. You might begin to stagnate. All you had to do was look around and talk to a recruiter. He could find you a job maybe around the corner, or maybe you had to move 100 miles or 200 miles, but he could get you another 10, 15,000 a year. Or they would call you up and say, are you interested in this job over here? It's an elevation in status. You're going to be now a manager of this group, and we'll get you another 50,000 a year. That's what was occurring in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, especially in the science and technology domains. There was a competitive market for people who had the right skill sets. Okay, so in my case, I had a family, I had a house, the kids I made enough money, they could have all sorts of outside activities, and we could afford that, and we could afford, dental work and health insurance, and we weren't crazy. We didn't buy a new car every year. Some people did, but we had a reasonable lifestyle, a reasonable level of security. My job was never secure. In fact, that was another factor that comes into play. There are no secure jobs. If once upon a time you could go to work for General Electric and work for them for 40 years, that's not true anymore. Very seldom does anybody ever stay at a job long enough to get a pension. Now, if you're a government employee, that's not true. People go into government service, they can stay with the government for 20, 30 years. And that's true in the military. You can go into the military and stay 20, 30, 40 years and get a nice, if you will, whatever they call it, pension. Okay? But in the free market economy and society, very seldom does that happen anymore. People move around too much. People that go to work for Apple and may work, if they're okay working there, fine. But the dynamics are always changing, and even in a company like Apple, if you work 5, 7, 8 years and you haven't moved anywhere else, yeah, you may, I don't know. And things change so fast. Once, you know, in the mid-70s and early 80s, IBM had dominated with these big mainframes. Well, the technology changed underneath, and there were companies that sprang up that could build a little computer. I mean, it was big. It still cost 20, 30, 100 grand. But companies who could never afford an IBM mainframe, because it was millions of dollars, can now buy a 100 grand computer and automate their business. They were a beer distributor. They covered 5 states. They needed automation. They could not afford a big mainframe from IBM, and they may have even started over using what was called timeshare at the time, where they ran software on some kind of server someplace. But there were companies that came up who could build a $100,000 computer or a $70,000 computer, which would allow computerization to come down into small and medium-sized companies. And it gave them a competitive edge. If they knew how to route their delivery people in some sort of mathematically good way, it gave them an edge. And I worked for one of those companies. And they did, you know, they zoomed from like $100,000 annual to over $1 billion in 3-4 years. They went from sales of $100,000 to $1 billion in 3-4 years by producing these mini computers, as they were known at the time. And I was recruited to work there because they needed people. They didn't have a lot of trained people in this particular area. And, you know, I'd been doing defense work and I knew this stuff, and I had a hands-on since right out of college. Whereas at that time, I think there were like 5,000, if you will, qualified programmers in the United States, 5,000, of which in the scientific world there may have been only 1,000 of us. I know you say it sounds impossible, but it was the truth. Most programmers in the 1960s and 70s, even 80s, all did business programming. They were all in the business world. Scientific programming and defense programming and all that sort of scientific oriented, how you count, like NASA, when it came along, they had to recruit people to be able to do calculations, trajectory from here to the moon and back. That was not something programmers knew how to do that worked in business, believe me. They didn't do that. They didn't know any of that stuff. Okay. Anyway, mini computers came along, and, you know, the thing was flush with cash, and they sold and they sold and sold. And then all of a sudden there's IBM with their little personal computer, and Apple comes out with a Macintosh. And it's a seismic shift and change. Now home people have their own computers, and businesses which could not afford a $100,000 mini computer can now afford a $5,000 personal computer and rig it to other personal computers and run software and jig it and rig it together to be able to run and gain a more efficiency on their mid to lower size company. And evolution started occurring down there at that level, and personal computers took off and they start going into everywhere. And one of the things that came out of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s was interconnecting of computers. It had started down to a small level first. You know, get two computers to talk to each other over some distance. And the method at that time was dial-up telephone lines. You used telephone lines. It was an existing infrastructure there. And the transmission rate was very slow, but you could, in fact, and there was software that had to be built, hardware had to be built, put into computers so they could talk. What I'm saying is I'm laying the groundwork for the internet. And this is coming and evolving and coming into place during this time period, which has implications through everything, through the culture, through the politics, all of it. Now we become a technology driven. America becomes technology driven, and it has impacts on everything. Cars sold in the 70s may have got 10 miles a gallon or 15 miles a gallon, and if they sold it on TV, the major advertising point at the time was it's got 4 cup holders. Cars did not have cup holders in the 1950s or 1960s. No. Now you got cup holders. That's our big evolutionary advance. In the 70s and 80s, the car company, who really only knows how to build engines and how to shape metal, was faced with the fact they got to start adding some more features to their car, and to get the gas mileage required, you're going to have to put computers in their cars. They had to recruit engineering. You see the trends that are occurring here? And today, you take for granted, you step in a car and it's got a computer in it, and a video display, and push buttons, and touch screens, and music, and functions, and features, and icons. Well, that's taken 40 years. Car company didn't know anything about electronics. The minimum, they knew how to wire a relay. They didn't know how to do anything with computers. The first real computer that went in was made by Bosch Corporation and had to do with energy management to get that fuel efficiency up. And that was Bosch is a German company. And they invented that, and it became a standard for fuel management, and you went to fuel-injected cars. That came in the 60s and 70s. It had not been common. Cars were still carburetor, air, gasoline mix. Fuel injection came in, and now that allowed you to have some kind of electronic control of fuel management. But you had to have engineers to know how to do that. The skill set required for those higher and paying jobs are moving up. The lower level jobs, like putting the car together, is being slowly reduced because we're investing in new infrastructure in the factories that use more robotics, that use different efficiency tools of all kind, and the engineers are now making assemblies in such a way that it cuts 5 people. They don't need 5 people to put that assembly on now, just 1. There are trends that are occurring, and it affects everything. Politics, you cut people off of out of work. They don't have money to consume anything. TVs, okay. That's one of the factors. There are social things that occur off of all of this. I will jump forward. It should become obvious to you. But cell phones and internet start coming into play in a very crude way, but it's there. Suddenly, you now have the individual down in my home with some ability to communicate with like-minded people over some distance. And once upon a time, and that was true, you lived in a town, you were born in a town, you grew up in a town, all the people you knew lived within that town or within a short distance. That had changed after World War II. It changed. It's always changing. People move from here and there for all kinds of reasons, okay? But now, not only, the distance, you got a friend in Oklahoma. You don't see them every day. But now, with computers and email was a new concept that only came around in, the late, early 90s or something in there. Email, and I remember studies going on. What is email traffic going to be in the year 2020? How much is there? Because somebody's got a plan to support that level of email on some kind of, you don't think about it, you don't worry about it, you don't know about it, but there's got to be backbone communication cables put in to support such stuff. Engineers have to do it. There have to be people trained, installed to know how to do fiber optics. But you have to have skill sets. Okay? So the level of skill sets have been gradually increasing for the last 50 years. No longer high school education. If that's all you got, it's going to be tough. If you don't have a specific skill set. Okay, so internet is coming. Computerization, consumers are now, it took a while, I mean, not everybody was computer literate, believe me, but they could see how it could really help you. When I was in business early on and working in the defense contract and whatever, I had a secretary, and I would have to handwrite my stuff, give it to the secretary, who would then type it, give it back to me, I would edit it, give it back to her, and she would then type it again or change it. That all changed when word processing came in. I had a computer on my desk now. I had to create my own documents. Secretaries started disappearing. You don't need them. The technology, yeah, if you were president of a company, of course you had secretary and a couple executive secretaries at that. Or if you were in government, you had lots of support staff that did stuff like that. The president doesn't write his own documents. He doesn't have, you look at in the presidential office, there's no computer sitting on his desk. He didn't do that. But me as an engineer in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, 2000s, I had to write my own documents. The secretary of staff were gone. That disappeared, even in white-collar jobs, if you want to call it that. And continues today. Various support occupations are being cut out of the fabric structure by technology, and it is only going to continue, rightly or wrongly. As I said, I gave you an example of MBAs who's never done a damn thing in his life. He got hired to look at the efficiency of a whole division for General Electric light bulbs and says, that plant over there has got to go, and fires all those people without a thought, bloodless spreadsheets. That was a horror for 70, late 70s, whatever. Absolute horror. I don't know if they still learned their lesson, but anyway. So I rambled on. The 80s and 90s for me was basically work, and that was true for most people, and it's only gotten more so during that period, especially in the 80s and 90s. Even 70s, the two-person, the mother and father both had jobs. The disappearance of a stay-at-home mom, it had occurred probably in the 60s, started then. It was on a way to make it. And women, by choice, didn't necessarily want to stay home with children. After they got to a certain age, why not work? And they could enhance the lifestyle of the family by both partners working. And that became pretty much the norm. I don't care what socioeconomic class you are. I know people who, one of them is a doctor and another is a lawyer, and they don't have any children at all, and they have a fabulous lifestyle. They have brand new Mercedes all the time. They take 5-week vacation to France, Other people, they both, the husband and the wife, or partners, whatever. I don't know all of the cultural correctness anymore, but both, if you're cohabitating with somebody, you both tended to work. You both need to work to have a reasonable lifestyle, to be able to go out and have chicken dinners or whatever it is, and have a pool in your house. Okay, that has been occurring. That's a good thing and a bad thing. There's some people always saying, I think personally it is important that a child have a mom and a dad and see them regularly when they're growing up. I don't think there's any, to some extent the government realized the issue, and you can go back and look at books like 1984, and the government starts playing more and more a role in the raising of children. We want to raise your children right. We need workers. We need educated workers for our survival in this world. And if you can't do it, we'll do it. And the whole you know, more and more government influence over public education. States had responsibilities, but education is not uniform to all the states. Someone who gets a high school, graduates high school in South nowhere, Kansas, does not have the same level of education as someone who lives in Alexandria, Virginia, or in Boston, Massachusetts, who goes to a private high school or even a public high school. So the government has been, they continue to evolve their regulation and their molding of various institutions throughout American society from all dimensions, all directions. Okay, so I've rambled on a lot. Hopefully I've given you some idea. The economy is always an important factor in any time period. And there are a lot of factors on that: political, the whole concept of free trade. Yeah, it's very complex and very dynamic. The mini computer company that I worked for that went from 100 grand to a billion gross sales a year, I think about 10, 12 years later, they're out of business. It changed again. My personal computers came along, and when they learned that people learned how to tie them together, they didn't need the $30,000 to $50,000 mainframe with dumb terminals hanging off of it. And those people were slow in adapting, and you can understand it from a point. I'm selling a $100,000 mini computer. Why do I want to be selling a $4,000 unit? I can only make, you know, $300 in a $4,000 unit when I can make $13,000 on a $100,000 unit. They weren't, well, they didn't, they could see it, but there was nothing they could do about it, really. They didn't try to adapt to the shifting world of technology, which you think, well, that's pretty dumb because they were a technology company to start with. Why didn't they see that? Why didn't they move? Corporations can become behemoth and move really slow. That is true. All successful corporations or large organizations like the federal government. The government is slow to move. I don't care what it is. You have a disaster. Well, you have the emergency prepared, or FEMA, Federal Energy Emergency. Okay, you have a hurricane in New Orleans. Well, they're going to come in and help. They eventually do. Might take them 6 months to get there, or longer, but they help. But they're very slow because they're so bureaucratic. They've been around for so long, and they've so many people, and you got to get yes from every one of them, or they have to just talk it to death and agree on what they're going to do. And that's true in all corporations. I don't care if you get to a certain size, you run into that. And they are slow to adapt to a changing market. The internet, it should be obvious to anybody that's out there that's watching this, that the internet has changed dynamically the retail world. Amazon was founded in the 80s. Okay. Looking back on it, you can say, well, that should have been obvious to everybody. That was just going to take off like gangbusters. You know, I can order it. I don't even have to go into a store and pick it out, you know. And if I'm living in Kansas and there's not even a store around that sells tiaras or pink bow ties, I can get it off the internet and have it delivered to me. Now my shopping experience is the whole world. It's not limited to the town I live in. It should have been obvious. So to some people it was obvious. To others not so. How do they adjust? Sears and Roebuck, how did they adjust? Not very well. J.C. Penney's. I can't even think of all the companies that have gone out of business in the last 15 years because they had no way to compete against the Amazons of the world or online internet sales. They tried something or other. I mean, they tried to ship they were slow coming going online. They were used to doing retail a certain way, and they perfected that. how to retail, how to organize their stores and what to carry in their stores. And they adopted merchandising, inventory tagging, and they did all that. They did that. What they didn't understand was the reach of the internet, and they didn't have anybody on our staff. They didn't want IT people. They didn't want information technology people. They didn't need them. Yeah, they had them someplace to control, their payrolls and their finance and all that kind of stuff, and maybe their inventory control purposes, but not to the point of sell directly to an individual over medium. No, they didn't have the people. They didn't even know how. They didn't have anybody on board even know how to think about doing that. Okay, they got behind the curve. Once you're behind the curve, and these days you're in big trouble because it moves very quickly. You say, well, Apple. Well, I'm going to buy Apple stock tomorrow because it's going to be in 2040. Apple's to me worth $4 trillion a share. Not necessarily so. I don't care who you are. Somebody else can come along and do it faster, cheaper, and better than you. Or the whole technology gets replaced with something you can't even imagine. You think, well, the internet's here. And it will be for a while. I'm not saying that. But who knows? They come out with some kind of brand new, laser-dominated high frequency, everything goes to cell phone towers, and you shuffling around 500 gigabits a second to some other media. You don't need cable anymore. You don't need fiber optics anymore. They come out with a little thing that, like Apple. You have an apple in your ear, and you talk to it, it talks back, you tell everything you want. You have one on your belt. I mean, who can envision? But I'm saying it changes, and it changes very quickly. And even Apple, who you think they'll be here 50, 100 years from now. That's not true. The number of companies in existence today that were in existence in 1900, Levi Strauss, Levi Jeans, I know that company is still around and was here in the 1900s. But very few others are. And if they are, they're in the consumer goods sector, like soap manufacturing or detergent manufacturing, personal care items, and it's not a big surprise, Warren Buffett and all the big investors, those guys tend to stick with the everyday, ordinary soap products. People always need shampoo. They always need toothpaste. Not flashy, but consistent. The more people you got, the more toothpaste you're going to sell. Whereas in the technology domain, or even in the car domain, as Detroit's actually moving fairly quickly on the whole electrical vehicle thing. I'm kind of surprised. They haven't done it probably very well yet. They're offering products, but nowhere near the mileage that makes them, a reasonable buying choice. Okay, but they do have products, and they've done pretty good to come up, because that's not something they're used to at all. They're used to internal combustion engines, although a lot of a concept that has always been around. It's called integrators. All you do is all the components come to you and you put them all together. You don't manufacture each individual component. You don't make the car door. That's done by somebody else. And you tell them how you want it done, and they do it in a small town. They ship it to you. You put it with the other car doors on the hoods and you sell it, and you're called an integrator. You don't manufacture those things. You do it with specialized companies and let them control their costs and let them control the quality of the product. That's not uncommon. That had been coming on. That was a business model that came on for a long time ago, and especially in the computer area. IBM, when they came out with their personal computer, that was a real switch for them, because they'd been used to manufacturing all of the components that went into their mainframes. And that was a schism, a cultural split, what was the word they used back in the 60s? There was a schism the culture fractured. There was a fracturing. IBM, believe it or not, as monolithic and huge as they had a fracture. They allowed a fracture to occur. They went into the personal computer arena. They started it. And they did not manufacture, you didn't have to have an IBM hard drive. You didn't have to have, they would allow any. Apple stuck with their, you got to get it from me for a long time. And it hurt them. It did. In worldwide sales. When you have to buy a hard drive from Apple, it costs $500. You can buy the same hard drive from a manufacturer who only makes hard drives for $50. The people who are making it, you got to have $500. They're going to lose the sale. I mean, I'm like, when people got smart enough to know, you know, oh, there's brand loyalty. I can't even. Anyway, all during that period, I did my work. I tried to make more money as I could, and that sometimes meant shifting from one job to another. I got older, I picked up more responsibility. That's the only way you could get paid. I mean, you get so expensive, you can't be a grunt on the line just putting wheels on. Yeah, I mean, people got cost of living raises or something like that, but to make any real jump in income, you had to move from one company to another, and that was usually more responsibility, and you might be there for 3-4 years and then go somewhere else. That's a changing landscape of the economics. From the kid point of view, my children grew up in a certainly different world than I did, and they had more opportunities. They also, the schools were bigger. They met more people. Drugs that I had talked about earlier became just part of the noise of the culture in the background. It no longer is always there. I mean, it just is. Nobody's really surprised about it anymore, you know. Long hair. Other people's rights. The whole gay lesbian, the whole civil rights thing bled over into other things. People had rights for this and that. There was recognition of the horror that we Americans had inflicted upon indigenous people, American indigenous people. It's complexity. America continues to be this thrashing, complex engine of all these different factors, and one clashes. Sometimes the gears don't mesh, and something will break and it gets replaced, or there's always evolution, always revolution going on, and it is till today. We take for granted cell phones and internet and high-speed computers, and I don't even know what the next big thing is. You know, I did realize in the 1990s, the next big thing was going to be communications. It was, and we're still adjusting to having instant communications, and every single person can have a platform. When I was a kid, people would come to the town square and they would bring in they call them soapboxes, but it was a wooden box. They would step on a wooden box and they would start ranting about their particular issue. I'm gay and I should have every right in the world to do this, or I'm God is your savior, and they would preach to you off of the soapbox. But the crowd may be 20 people or something. But now, with the internet and what a new term, social media, everybody can have a soapbox. Everybody can champion a cause. Everybody can say, me or you're not doing it right. You can be a critic. Everybody can do that. And when people are, they got time on their hands to look around the internet, they can find like-minded people and they group together. And you may be separated by hundreds of thousands of miles, but there are people like you. And you say, I don't like tuna fish. And they say, I don't like it either. Let's ban tuna fish. That's what we need to do. Let's get them sell some flags. And we'll block off the cities and we'll say, no more tuna fish. No more tuna fish. So individual rights, you can form a group for anything and campaign for any kind of change, social, economic, political. I listen to AM radio and you'll hear people say, the federal government owes me a house. I have a right to a house. How come I don't have a house? I have a right to a house. And the federal government somewhat has instilled that concept, rightly or wrongly, through the culture, through the population. You're entitled. You should have the right. You should, I'm sure people growing up today think, well, okay, I'm going to have a home and it's going to be nice. I might have a pool. I'm going to have a really nice car, fast car. I'll have, high-speed internet. I'm going to have a big screen TV. I'm going to, I'll have a maid who's going to fix me dinner every night. They may have expectations of what their lifestyle is going to be like. And some aspect of that is they think they're going to be entitled to that. The fact that they exist, the fact that they're in America, that somehow or another the government or somebody else will provide. It has been seeping through the culture for some time that don't worry about it. I mean, you can look at it from this perspective. When Social Security came in, you don't even need to worry about your retirement. Once upon a time, your retirement was your children, and they took care of you, looked after you when you got old. Well, that concept is still true in some cultures, but and I'm sure that it still happens in the United States. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't, but I'm just saying, don't worry about it because the government's got you covered. We're going to send you a check, Social Security check every month, and then later on they said, we're going to take care of your health care too. Don't, You're old and we are a rich enough country, we should take care of our elderly. I like the concept. I'm an old guy. Of course I like it. I didn't like it so much when I was young, and what they took out of my taxes for Social Security and health care was more than my income taxes. And I got nothing out of it. And I may never get nothing out of it. That was my thought. But anyway, I think we're probably coming up on another sort of schism, fracturing. And I don't know all the elements of that, but I do know one of the elements of that is where population expectations don't meet the reality, and it can be very cold and hard. Or, the federal government policy is no longer aligning with the majority of the people living underneath that government. They don't, they're doing things the majority out here are not happy with. At some time or another, something will schism, fracture, break. I don't know. I expect we're due for another one of those. One last point and I'm done. American Civil War. America was 13 original colonies. They were, and people who lived in the colonies could be different. One could have a lot of German, Irish. One could be Catholics from England or whatever. It varied a lot. But they were divided up, and they had governors, and they had local administrators, and so on and so on. And then the American Constitution, they, decided there was strength in numbers. The only way we could really separate ourselves from England, where we're not underneath their thumb, was come together as a group and form the United States of America, and then we'll be able we'll defeat, they try to send troops over, we'll defeat them, and we'll declare ourselves a nation. And out of that became states with a federal government, okay? And I think at the founding point, at that particular time, states were really what it was all about, because I don't know what to care what's going on in Florida. I'm way up here in Boston or whatever. And I take care of my people here, and I set the rules and regulations for that. Federal government was kind of an afterthought. It didn't really, might deal with foreign affairs, England, who we trade with, something like that. But over a period of time, federal government starts getting more and more powers, and there are issues. Best example again is environmental. One state has coal-fired plants, and smoke comes out the stack, and the winds blow it over to another state. And the state here, they don't have a problem with pollution because it's blowing out of my state. It didn't bother me. It's bothering some other state. Well, the federal government then does have to come in and say, no, you can't do that. You know what? One state can't have a negative impact on another state. That's not right. And that was, I think, the starting of where the federal government comes in to become more powerful in that sense. There is some, you need to have somewhat the same sort of something across all states. Okay, during the Civil War, you know, I don't know how many states there were, but the South was agricultural and based upon slave labor, cheap labor. The North, however, didn't have the same rich farmland, and they had become more manufacturing oriented. There were textile mills in the North. There was, you know, and heavily populated up there, not so heavily populated in the South, farming agriculture. And when it came about a cultural issue, they said, well, slavery is not a good thing. And I'm not saying, you know, I agree, slavery is not a good thing. And the federal government says to those states, what they really said was, any new states, you can't have slaves. They sort of went along with the concept the South's going to have slaves, but no more slaves. And they had banned, the federal government had banned slave trade in, I don't know, 1820 or 30, something like that. They banned it, although that didn't end it. There was no real enforcement. They banned it, but no enforcement, which is common. Okay. So here's a case where the federal governments are now saying, okay, new states can't have slaves. And some of the people that are living already in that territories that were going to become new states, some of them agree with that, some of them don't. There's conflicts occur out there. The federal government is beginning, I already got the ban. States in the South say, you know, you're not playing fair here. You're telling me what to do, and I don't want to do that. And actually, I think the South said, screw you, we'll have our own country. And this was going to inevitably happen. If you think about it, there was an artificial formation of all these different, all who had leaders and authorities sprinkled. You know, Kansas had different authorities than Alabama or Georgia or whatever. They had local leadership control. Here's the federal government in some far-off location saying, no, you can't do that. No. Well, so the South said, look, we'll just have our own separate country. We don't go along with what you're telling us. We just disagree. And you won't negotiate with us, you know. So I think the South, they fired the first shot. They did. And they said, we're going to succeed. We're going to become our own country. And it was only Lincoln and the will of Lincoln, personally, who said, no, we're one country, indivisible. You can't do it. Now, I don't know, some other leader, we might have had multiple countries in the United States. But the issue was the federal government, what they control, and what falls under purview of state control. That's really the issue that was in the Civil War. And everybody said it was all about race. Well, yeah, that was one of the states' rights that they were arguing about, but there were other things. There were other issues. It hadn't just been that issue. There were other, and they've been coming up over time. The feds are now saying, look, we need to act as one. The South saying, well, yeah, I agree, except I don't like the way you're acting, so we'll just pull away from you and we'll do what we want to do. All right. Civil War was a states' rights issue, and we're going to divide up. We have a states' rights issue again, and we will always have this issue. Again, it was an artificial consortium of various people living in various areas who artificially got divided up into what's called states with their own authorities, their own leadership, their own whatever. And now you got this central government up here, based in Washington, D.C., who is trying to ride herd over all these states, and they do need to. Like I said, pollution is an example, but there are others. But the best and clearest is where one state sends all their dirty crap across to another state. You can't do that. I mean, that should be clear to everybody. There are lots of issues like that where the federal government is required to standardize rules and regulations across all states. certain things. I mean, California has its own emissions standards for automobiles. They did that. If you want to sell a car in California, it's got to meet this. It's not the same as the federal government put on Detroit automobile manufacturers. It's a higher standard. In most cases, automobile manufacturers finally said, look, we're just going to do the California standard. It's higher already than the federal government standard. And that way we don't have to make two different kind of cars to sell. And so, and there's a case where the state influenced policy more so than the federal government did. But we're back in that situation today, and that whole state right evolutionary thing is being followed out at political levels, economic levels, and we're not done with that either. But the central point, I don't care what time period you want to say, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010, you have all these dynamics that are affecting the individual down at the individual point, from how much food they have to how much money they can spend or they not have, or how much the police are on your back because you're the wrong skin color, or how much violence and crime is in your neighborhood. All kind of factors. Anyway, this is Uncle Ron and stuff. This was talking about, it was trying to focus on the 1980s, 1990s, but no way to pull it all apart and properly dissect it. It's a fluid, dynamic, changing thing, all kind of variables and influences, and I've left out half of the parameters that came into play, but certainly technology became a significant influencer on the American dynamic in that period. This is going around and stuff, and this is the 8th of June, 2024. I hope this helps, Olivia. It's too long, but nonetheless. Bye-bye now.